Innovation, disruption, and big issues. This is Business Game Changers with Sarah Westall.
Welcome to Business Game Changers. I'm Sarah Westall. Today we're going to be talking to John Perkins, who is the self-proclaimed economic hitman. He has a new edition of his book that just recently came out last year. And this interview actually is from last fall, but I haven't been able to play it on my two satellite channels that I air on, and also hasn't been played on YouTube. So I am replaying it now. It's still very fresh and current, but it gives you an inside look at how all the power broker deals happen at the head of state level, and how the global elite, using the United States resources and military, how they get the world to do what they want them to do, and how they manipulate the banking system and the resources all over the world for their benefit. It's a real deep look at how all the power brokering goes on at that level, and how it really needs to be cleaned up, and how we need to look at the world's citizens in a way that doesn't take advantage of people. But I don't want to waste more time, and I want to get into this interview. But before I do that, I want to remind you of my Patreon account at patreon.com/Sarah Westall. All my ebooks come for free with $2 a month, and you get my first two ebooks for free for $1 a month. So let's get into the interview with John Perkins. Hi, John. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be with you.
Well, let's dive right into this fascinating topic. What is an economic hitman?
Well, I think it's fair to say that economic hitmen have really created the world's first truly global empire. And it's really a corporate empire, not an American empire. It's supported by the U.S. government to a large degree, the Pentagon, the CIA, et cetera. But it's really a corporate empire. And economic hitmen work in a number of different ways, but perhaps the most generic description would be to say that we identify countries with resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange huge loans to those countries from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. However, the money doesn't actually go to the countries. Instead, it goes to our own corporations that make huge profits off building big infrastructure projects.
So basically the country gives the loans, but the majority of it comes back in forms of contracts to Western or to United States companies. Is it Western or U.S.?
Well, it used to be, when I was in the business, primarily U.S., and now it's hard to identify where these companies are from. Halliburton is no longer really a U.S. corporation. It's located in the Middle East. Its headquarters are located in Dubai. So these are global corporations. That's what they really are.
They're moving to places that are friendlier to what they want to get accomplished.
Yeah, although the majority of them are still officially recognized as U.S. corporations, but most of them don't pay U.S. taxes. So you get a question.
Well, yeah, if they're not paying U.S. taxes and their headquarters in Dubai, they're not really a U.S. company.
Even if their headquarters are here, their financial entities are in other countries, so they don't pay taxes, even though their CEO may be stationed in New York or San Francisco or someplace. It's really a terrible system. They use all of our infrastructure. They use our military. They use our CIA. They use our schools and our fire departments and police departments and highways and airports, and they don't pay taxes. But that's different today than when I was in the business in the 70s. Go ahead.
So what are their goals? And I don't want to cut you off because I want to hear what you have to say about what you're going to say, but what are their goals before we move on?
Well, their goals are to become incredibly powerful and wealthy, essentially to run a new global empire. To
take over whatever they're trying to take over and control that country's resources and do it on a global scale.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, you in your book, which is amazing. It does read like a novel. It's pretty interesting. But in your book, you were actually set up by the NSA. You were approached and educated by the NSA. Now, does the World Bank and all these institutions, do they know what they're doing? I mean, is it conscious behavior or is a lot of it unconscious?
Depends on who you mean. The World Bank, is just an organization like a corporation. I lots of times talk about how we have two realities that we deal with, an objective reality, the computers or microphones we're talking over, and the perceived reality, which is the words we're saying. Corporations and organizations like the World Bank are really perceived realities. So the World Bank was organized at the end of World War II, and its mission was to reconstruct a devastated Europe. It did a pretty good job of that, actually. But then it became deeply involved in the Cold War and proving that capitalism was better than communism. So things changed. Today in the World Bank, you have many people that go into the World Bank with the best of intentions, and some of them stay there with the best of intentions. But at the top echelons, certainly they know what they're doing, and their job is to help the big corporations get more resources. Their job is to make sure that our corporations, what I call the corporatocracy, the leaders of the big global corporations, get what they want from the world in terms of resources, human resources and natural resources.
And we know that they know, because they wouldn't be there if they didn't know, because they have to accomplish those tasks
at the highest levels. And again, I want to emphasize, there's a lot of people working for these institutions that have no idea, that think they're doing good things. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And incidentally, the book has been, especially during its first 6 or 7 years, was extremely popular in the World Bank. In its bookstore, it was listed as one of their top 10 bestsellers.
In amongst the World Bank.
At the World Bank bookstore, yes, in Washington, D.C.
Interesting. So the average employee really wanted. Now, what did they say to you? What did employees of the World Bank say to you? I mean, did any top people talk to you about it, or did they just kind of ignore it and write you off and try to act like it's not true?
Well, the top people don't talk about it. But I've spoken to different groups at the World Bank. I had dinner several years back after speaking there in the World Bank offices. So at an auditorium, I had dinner after that with a group of young people who work there. Some of the younger employees, all with higher educational degrees, who told me one after another that they had joined the bank because they wanted to do good things. They liked the mission of the bank, which is the stated mission, is to end world poverty. But they said that, once they got in there, they discovered that wasn't what was going on. And they discovered that what I say in my books is true. And they were asking me, so what should we do? What do you recommend? And they were very dissatisfied, very discouraged.
Everybody feels stuck in a system that they don't know how to get out of.
Yes, it's a big problem, and I think we can say the same. I spend a lot of time with corporate executives and speak at conferences of corporate executives, and I hear over and over again, Sarah, that many of these men and women would like to do better. They would like to make a better world, a more environmentally sustainable and regenerative world, socially just world, but they're afraid that if they step a little too far and their corporations lose 0.5% of market share, their top stockholders, or what I call the corporatocracy, the people that really run the world, will fire them and replace them with someone who only cares about market share.
It's really true, because that's that's the system that we're in. And the sad part is you only have a certain budget and you got to get all this stuff done, but you still got to pay yourself and pay your mortgage. You're kind of caught into this cycle.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wrote The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman about 12 years after the last one the original came out, because it really encourages we, the people, to understand that we have to make the change. That although this economic hitman system that I was part of, and that primarily we were working in the developing countries at that time, it spread to the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. It's gotten a lot worse, and only we, the people, can change it. That it's run by corporations, and yet we have control over corporations. They only survive because we support them by buying their goods and services, by investing in them, by working for them, by allowing our tax dollars to basically subsidize them. And so we can change that. It's up to us to make these changes, we the people. And in the book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I outline a lot of strategies that different people can employ, but every one of us can do something every day, even if it's as easy as sending an email out to everybody we know once a week or so, or as complex as forming consumer movements and demonstrations and marches.
Before we get into like how it started to affect the United States, because we're in major debt and so is Europe. And so I want to talk about what this construct is a little more and then map it to what we're dealing with today. In your book, you also talk about jackals. What are jackals?
When economic hitmen fail, when leaders of countries don't go along with this system, in other words, my job was to go to these countries to convince leaders of the countries to accept these huge debts, that the debts were used then to hire our corporations to build big infrastructure projects that helped a few rich people in the country, including the leaders and their friends and family, but didn't help the majority of the people at all, who were too poor to buy electricity or drive cars on highways or work in industrial parks that don't hire very many people. And yet the country would be left holding this huge debt. So I'd go back at some point and say, hey, since you can't pay your debts, sell your resource, oil or whatever, real cheap to our corporations without any environmental restrictions or social regulations, or privatize. Sell or give your electric utility, your water and sewage system, your schools, your banks, your jails, all your public sector businesses to our corporations. So basically it was putting these people in deep debt and then getting an exchange which really created a corporate empire. When leaders resisted, then the jackals go in. And these are people who either overthrow these leaders or assassinate them, overthrow governments or assassinate the leaders. And I discuss in the New Confessions about how that happened to me with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, democratically elected, and Omar Torrijos, head of state of Panama. They had tremendous integrity. They would not buy into these deals. They wouldn't play the game. And they were both assassinated by CIA assets.
And they were pretty great people. They were just looking out for their own people. They weren't anti-U.S. They weren't pro-communism. They weren't anything. They were just trying to make sure that any deal they put together was good for their people.
That's correct. And it's sometimes people are shocked when I say this. They say, that can't be true. But the fact is the CIA, the United States, Henry Kissinger and others have admitted to the huge role that the U.S. played in taking out Allende of Chile and Arbenz of Guatemala, Mossadegh of Iran. These are all on the record. Lumumba of the Congo, Diem of Vietnam. I mean, we've admitted to these things. And, my own personal experience I've been involved in seeing that happen. And of course, the leaders of these countries know that, which actually makes my job much easier, because when I go in and try to convince them to take these loans, and as I said, their families will make a lot.
They know you're serious. You don't have to convince them. They know.
Well, basically, I'm saying, sign off on this loan and get a few $100 million for you and your family and friends through various techniques, and I can explain those if you like. Or don't sign off on it. Don't agree to this and face the jackals.
Jeez. So it was a hard to resist thing, because you either get this money for your families or you die.
Yeah.
and they know that maybe it's awful, because they don't have, it's a lose-lose for them, or a win-lose, or however you want to look at it.
In fact, Sarah, in the New Confessions, I described two very recent occurrences. Well, one in 2009, when President Zelaya, democratically elected president of Honduras, was overthrown because he refused to play the game. He went up against Dole and Chiquita and other big U.S. corporations or global corporations, but did not play the game and was overthrown in a coup. President Correa of Ecuador, who took a very strong stance against oil to begin with, saw this happen. And I go into the detail of the book of how he's been compromised and has understood that he has to play the game in order to stay in power. And if he gets thrown out of power, the next guy will be nothing but a puppet. So he's faced with, and Correa wrote a very good endorsement for Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I know the man. I've spent a lot of time in Ecuador. And he's confronted by an extremely difficult situation.
Oh, geez. Well, can you go into the Middle East, what happened in Saudi Arabia, and how that whole system is set up? Because that's really fascinating, because that has so much implications to what's going on right now. Not that South America doesn't, but that the Middle East with Syria and all the countries that were going in and doing stuff too. How does all that fit in? Yeah. And the petrodollar. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it's such a long story, and I mean.
Oh, come on! You can explain all geopolitical situations in 5 minutes.
Right, I'll do that. But because I think most of your listeners know how the Middle East has been, sort of colonized by European countries for well over a century. And you can watch the movie Lawrence of Arabia or something and understand. But the U.S. involvement really took off in early 1950s when the CIA overthrew a democratically elected prime minister named Mossadegh, who wanted to ensure that his people got a fair share of profits made from Iranian oil by what became BP, British Petroleum. And he, in the United States, objected to that. Anyway, we overthrew him, replaced him with the Shah, who was a terribly brutal dictator. And eventually he was overthrown, and there was huge blowback. The Iranians had great resentment. The mullahs got into power, and most of us know the rest of the story. Now, that's had a huge impact all over the Middle East.
And you were involved with that, right? I mean, you...
Well, I worked in Iran for 10 years. I'd go for a week or a month or two at various times during the 70s. I was in Iran a lot, and I was there. I tell the story in the book about how I was taken out by a CIA agent, helped to escape the night before the bombs went off and the revolution against the Shah started in 1978. But in any case, I often think if we just supported Mossadegh and said, the Iranian people deserve to get some of the proceeds from Iranian oil, that could have changed the whole history of the Middle East. However, we didn't do that.
We feel that we deserve all of it, or what? How does that work?
The oil companies in those days, and it still continues, feel that they are above the law. They have a long history of setting up contracts that make sure that the countries don't get any money back. One of the ways they do this is you look on paper and it'll say that Iran or Ecuador or whatever the country is going to get 50, 60% of all the profits made from oil taken out of that country. But the contract is between Texaco Ecuador or BP Iran, and the profits are actually made by Texaco Latin America or Texaco USA or or Texaco Switzerland. So there's this accounting system that's set up so ultimately the country no profit is ever shown for the country that has signed the agreement with whatever company.
So is it really a collaboration between our government and the military or the spy agencies like NSA and CIA and the oil companies, construction companies / engineering companies, and then the banking? I mean, it's kind of like a 4-tier leg.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a new book about the Bechtel Corporation that's recently come out, which talks about that corporation. It's incredibly strong ties with the government. And this is typical, the revolving door. So the president of Bechtel Corporation, big construction company that's won huge contracts recently since the war in Iraq and the Middle East, today continues to win these. One of its presidents was George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, and its chief attorney was Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense, and on and on, this revolving door. But getting back to the Middle East, to your original question, so in the early 70s, there was an oil embargo implemented by OPEC against the United States. It was dire. It was going to throw us into a deep depression. The Treasury Department, U.S.
And that's because they were gaining power. By having OPEC, they were gaining the Saudi Arabia was gaining power over the price of oil.
Well, OPEC had power over controlling the supply of oil because OPEC controlled most of the world's oil. And Saudi Arabia and the other Arab countries were incensed about our support of Israel in the early 70s. And so they implemented an embargo against the U.S. The U.S. Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, we can't let this ever happen again. We've got to stop this. We can't let it happen. Do something. So I knew that to do something meant bribing, basically, the House of Saud, the Royal House of Saudi Arabia. And I went off to Saudi Arabia. And to make a long story short, and the long story is in the book, it's a fascinating story of what we went through and of experiences I had with some of the the family of the Saud family, and one of the princes who I had to basically pimp for. And
yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, but to shorten the story, in the end, the royal house of Saudi Arabia agreed to basically send most all of its petrodollars back to the United States, investing them in U.S. Treasury securities. The interest from those securities was used to hire U.S. corporations to westernize Saudi Arabia, build desalination plants, oil refineries, and in fact, huge cities out of the desert. And that's amounted to trillions of dollars in contracts for corporations like Bechtel, who built a lot of those cities, and many other U.S. corporations, including the ones that supply equipment and computers, the General Electrics and the Westinghouses, and so many countries were involved. And part of the deal also was that OPEC would only buy and sell oil for dollars, which was a huge boost to the U.S. dollar. We'd gone off the gold standard in 1971 under Nixon. Now it's 1973. The dollar's floating around kind of wildly. And so suddenly we work a deal that puts it, that we have a petrodollar now, basically, that's substantiated by the fact that that's the only way you can buy and sell oil on the national market.
So if oil went away and we had an alternative energy, that would be the end of the dollar.
Well, unless the Federal Reserve and the CIA and the Pentagon figured another way to boost it up, which they undoubtedly, that's part of what they're doing today.
Is trying to figure it out so that we can get out from underneath this energy, because we aren't thriving as a society. We aren't evolving as a society because we're stuck in old world energy paradigms, and we can't. There's so many new innovations and ways that we can do energy that's so much better than that. And we're stuck because it's stuck to the dollar. They need to figure out how to we have to get out of those shackles so that we can thrive and evolve as a species.
It's a bigger issue even than that, Sarah, I think, because as I discussed in the book, we've really created what I call a death economy that's based on debt, militarization, and the destruction of the resources that actually support that economy. It's an economy that's consuming itself into extinction, and we know it's failing around the world. Everybody knows that. Everybody that studies it, that thinks about it, knows that. We need to move into a life economy that's based on cleaning up pollution, regenerating devastated environments, and creating new technologies for energy, transportation, communications, banking, basically everything. Technologies that recycle, that no longer destroy the earth. New technologies for agriculture that don't rely on huge amounts of insecticides and fertilizers and chemicals, the whole GMO chemical culture. And so we need to move into a new view of what it means to have an economy. And that's based on a perception that we have today. The current disastrous system, the failed system, is based on a perception that actually came out of 1976. When the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Milton Friedman, who said, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. Up until that point, including when I was in business school in the late 1960s, businesses thought that we were brought up to understand that we needed to make decent rate of return for investors, and we essentially needed to serve a public interest.
Yeah, it's not taking away what a business does. You can still make boatloads of money. You can still be super successful, but you have to look at it as in the context of what you're doing. The network we're on is called Conscious Business. And just being conscious of what you're doing, it doesn't mean you can't be super successful.
Yeah, and to define success and successful leaders as those who actually serve a public interest. And the United States has a long history. It came out of the founding fathers, a fear of the East India Company, which was one of the reasons we fought the revolution. So for 100 years, a business couldn't get a charter in the United States unless it was proved it was going to serve a public interest. That all changed in the late 1800s. But even when I was in business school in the late 60s, the concept was still there. And then when Friedman won the Nobel Prize in 76, that changed everything. The idea became, no, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits. And that gives CEOs the license, some would say the mandate, to do whatever it takes to maximize profits, including corrupting the democratic system, essentially bribing politicians, through their legal bribes these days, campaign financing. And
well, the problem is once it gets to that point, you really have a hard time once it becomes so corrupt, you almost have to bribe just to be in the game. That's the problem. And maybe the United States hasn't gotten to that point yet, which I don't think it has. But in other countries, like my husband's from Mexico, there's countries where it's so corrupt that if you don't pay your bribes, you are out. Like you have to pay the drug cartels just to be able to have a location to have your restaurant in.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It gets to that point.
Well,
and if we aren't careful, we will get there in the United States, and nobody wants that. Trust me.
I beg to differ.
You think we're already there?
I think we're far worse. I think.
Great. No, we're not like that on the everyday level that the people see. We're worse on the bigger picture level.
Right. I don't have to give the postal guy who comes to my door every day a little tip in order to get a package, under the table. No, I don't have to do that. We don't have to do what your husband described. We don't have to deal necessarily with drug cartels. But what we do have is a system where every major politician in this country is basically a hired economic hitman today. And I write in the book that in my day it wasn't true. But since 9/11, basically, what I write in the New Confessions is that in the last 14 years, things have changed radically. And today, every major politician is essentially an economic hitman.
So is that why they're afraid of Trump? Because he's not? Or is he and we just don't know it? What's the deal with Trump?
Yeah, I don't know what Trump is, and I don't know what Sanders is really, but what I do know...
Because both of those guys seem different.
What I do know is that both of them, the far left and the far right, if you want to call it that, that's a little oversimplification, but they both are saying that they're not taking any money from big business. They're the first candidates to really get to be serious and get there by saying that since John Kennedy, whose campaign was financed by his father. But what we have to understand is that even if someone gets into the Oval Office who's accepted no money from big corporations, he or she will be surrounded by people who have accepted big money. Senators, House of Representatives.
So will they get killed?
Today, you probably don't have to kill someone. You can destroy them. You can assassinate them politically with a rumor, a sex scandal, like Clinton was politically assassinated. He was impeached by a sex scandal.
But he really did it.
Well, he did. But remember, they know your weakness. So you send in someone like Monica Lewinsky,
So do you think she was a pawn?
Absolutely. I write about that in the book. I think she may have been an innocent pawn. I'm not suggesting that she set out to do something nefarious, but I think Linda Tripp, there's a lot of suspicions around that whole area, and that's detailed in the book. And we also had the head of the IMF, Strauss-Kahn, taken down by a sex scandal. He might well.
That one seems pretty suspicious.
Well, no, there's no question. Yeah, and there's no question. I don't think that Strauss-Kahn is a sex addict. But
well, how about the WikiLeaks guy that has two Swedish women?
Let me finish. Let me finish. So,
go ahead. We can talk all these examples. Go ahead.
So Strauss-Kahn is a sex addict, and if you want to take a sex addict down, what do? You put him in a position that he really can't turn down. And that's what happened. A chambermaid, went into his room, made sure she was available, and he had sex with her. And then she testified, and later she reneged on her testimony and said that it was consensual, that he didn't rape her. But it was set up so that he's already on an airplane on his way back to France. He's sitting on an airplane. And the New York police come in and take him off in handcuffs. And all the cameras are there rolling. They've notified the media that
so they already knew ahead of time. And meanwhile, all these other big people are raping people left and right, and nothing ever happens to them.
Yeah, but everybody in a high position knows they've got a weakness. It'll be used against them. And even if you have no weakness, even if you have no skeletons in your closet, can you imagine anyone who doesn't have any weaknesses or skeletons in their closet? But let's assume that person's there. But the FBI can create skeletons in your closet They have such control over the internet and media. I mean, they can create anything they want. So what I'm trying to say is that anybody in power these days understands that they're in a very vulnerable position. And even if they've done nothing wrong and accepted no money from corporations, they're surrounded by people whose campaigns are financed by big corporations, and who also understand that if they lose their own election for senator or House of Representatives or decide not to run, they'll get an extremely lucrative job as a consultant lobbyist for big corporations. So the system is very, very rigged, and it's very, very corrupt. And we need to change it. And we, the people, can do it because it's all...
But that's a cultural issue. We have a culture problem. A lot of it is just culture. I mean, it's not just culture. It's, but it's a culture problem.
It's a perception. So let's look at revolutions. And that's what we need right now. We need a revolution. It can be a peaceful one. It can be done primarily through the internet, through consumer movements. I talk about that extensively in the book. We don't have to take up guns. It can be done from the comfort of our homes. But revolutions are always caused by a change in perceived reality. I mentioned perceived reality earlier.
A paradigm shift.
Yeah, take 1773 in America. There was a common belief, a perceived reality, that the British Army was the most powerful in the world. It was invincible. George Washington had been at the Battle of the Monongahela 20 years earlier in the French and Indian War, and he'd seen a huge English army routed by a small band of Indians, totally wiped out, basically, destroyed. And so Washington was able to stand up before the Continental Congress and say, they're not invincible. All we got to do is hide behind trees like the Indians do. And they're standing out there.
Guerrilla warfare, just change it up. Don't march, don't march straight forward like a bunch of idiots.
Don't wear red coats and stand behind trees. And then Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson and others wrote magnificent inspirational pamphlets. And suddenly, within less than a year, the perceived reality had changed throughout the colonies. Oh, we can beat them. And we're at a time like that today where what we need to understand is that we have this perceived reality, that this is the best system there is. It may not be perfect, but it's the best there is. And all you got to do is watch the new Michael Moore movie to see that the people in many, many other countries, it goes through a whole bunch of other countries, especially in Europe, have much better systems in so many ways, from education, from democracy, from health insurance, and so on and so forth. We've got to change our perceived reality.
But, some people, and now I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit, because, the left and right are coming together. We all see that the corporations there's so much corporate fascism, right? And there's so much corruption. Getting the corruption out can be so much better. But the means in which we want to get there, some people believe that if we can just have a real free market, one that's not so corrupt, where there can be competition, but we have a society that holds people to higher standards, versus being more of a socialist one where we take care of what I'm saying? That we're a socialist one where it's more like, East Germany was, where Cuba was, where you just don't advance as a culture. And so people are afraid to move more in that direction because it will oppress people, versus one where we can have the freedom to innovate, but yet our culture is really evolved and conscious so that we don't do corrupt and evil things to each other.
Well, yeah. And I think, my point being that to a large degree, it boils down to changing the goal of corporations, because they control the world today. It's not governments. We're not going to change the laws in this land unless we get the corporations behind it, or we get corporations out of the legal process. We get campaign finance. It's not just corporations, but all wealth out of campaign financing.
Well, yes, but when the Supreme Court changed that so that we can have super PACs, that pretty much, and that was recently, that opened it wide up.
Yes,
that's just completely.
A very strong movement, a movement to amend, and a couple of others to get a constitutional change to that. But the other thing that what I advocate most strongly is that we can go after the corporations, and I like to tell people, there's a whole list of things in the book, but I'll name just three of them now, of things that everybody can do to turn this around and have fun doing it. And one of those is if every one of your listeners identifies a corporation, it could be Exxon or Nike or Monsanto or Walmart, identify a corporation that you'd like to see changed and write a brief email and say, hey, I love your products, but I'm not going to buy them anymore until you pay your workers a fair wage, or clean up the terrible pollution you've caused in the Amazon, or stop making seeds that require chemical fertilizers and insecticides.
But even a more positive way to go after it is the people who do operate the way that you want, that's who you buy from. That's even stronger. If you, not buying from them, of course, that's the same as what you're saying. But if you identify the companies that you believe in and the products that you believe in, and you just devote yourself to buying those companies, that will overnight change it. It's, you hit the street with your dollars.
Well, not unless you also tell them. It's not enough to vote with your dollars. You've also got to organize a campaign. What's your dollar worth?
Yeah, but people, for example, people are buying, instead of the fast food restaurants, they're going to higher quality food. And I know there's people talking about it, but they didn't care until the dollars changed. Now all these restaurants, they have to do that, because if they don't do that, they're not going to get the business.
Right. And GMOs are going to be labeled out by some of the biggest food producers in the country: Kellogg, General Mills,
Which is great.
Mars, ConAgra. And why? Because a small number of people in a state with only 0.02% of the U.S. population, Vermont, passed a law that said GMOs have to be labeled in their state. And so all these big companies said, well, since Vermont's passed that law, it seems to be the trend. We're going to label it all over the country. People spoke out.
Well, that's great, because people don't want to buy things unless they know it's going to be healthy for their bodies.
My point, Sarah, is we have to speak out. Yes, it's important how you shop, which companies you buy from, but you also need to let them know and let the ones know that you don't buy from. So let's assume that you've decided that you're not going to buy from Nike because they don't pay their workers enough money, and you found another company, maybe, that doesn't use sweatshops. But that's pretty difficult today, to buy a pair of tennis shoes from a company that doesn't use sweatshops.
Well, this gets back into that vicious cycle.
Let me finish.
Go ahead, finish.
So you send an email to Nike, and you get all your friends to send emails. You write up an email that says, hey, Nike, I love your tennis shoes, but I'm not buying them anymore until you pay your workers a fair wage in Indonesia and elsewhere. And you get all your social networking circles to send that out. That will have a huge impact. I know the president of Nike, Mark Parker, and he said he wants to get these. He wants to change, but he's afraid that if he loses market share, just 0.5%, Phil Knight and the other top stockholders will fire him.
See, that's the vicious cycle that I'm talking about. I see what you're saying. So support the executives. The executives want to do this, so help support them by showing them that you're going to support this. Because executives don't believe that the consumer is going to support them. They're just going to go to the next one that has a cheaper technology. Or because they can spend less on their production, they can spend more on marketing it. Exactly. I mean, and executives don't feel they have the support of the people, because people at the end of the day just want the cheapest product.
Well, right. And in many cases, it's very, very difficult to find a product. You said, go buy the right product, but in many cases, tennis shoe is a very good example. It's really difficult to find, for most people in this country, a tennis shoe that isn't made in sweatshops. And so we have to go to the people that we like their product. Let's say it's Nike or Converse or whatever one, but since Nike controls something like 50% or more of the market, if they change, everybody else will have to change.
Well, you kind of wish the country themselves would say, hey, this is what we need. Until the world will eventually balance out with wages. But it's hard, because I got to confess, I don't like to spend more money than I have to spend.
Well, you said it's the country. That's what I'm saying. The country is the consumers.
Oh, well, but I'm saying also the country that does we are the consumers for buying manufactured, we're the corporations that buy the manufactured products as well, and we're the consumers. But the country that produces them you wish there wouldn't be such a race to the bottom of having such a low margin that they resell their manufacturing for.
That race to the bottom is controlled by current day economic hitmen. They're called site location consultants. And I write about this extensively in the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Let's use an example that's right close to everybody's heart right now, including yours, Mexico, Central America, okay? We think we've got an immigration problem in the United States, people swarming from Central America. Why do we have that problem? Because of NAFTA and CAFTA, the free trade agreements that basically made it impossible for small farmers in Central America to sell their goods, because big U.S. manufacturing companies that make corn and products and cotton and so forth are heavily subsidized. The Guatemalans, the Hondurans, the Mexicans can't afford to subsidize, and they're not allowed to erect trade barriers. So even though it may cost twice as much to produce a bushel of corn in the United States as it does for a Mexican farmer, the big agribusiness in the United States gets a huge subsidy, so it can actually undersell the Mexican farmer in Mexico or Guatemala.
So they don't have a choice. They have to.
So they leave. They can't farm anymore. They leave their farms. They come to the United States as illegal immigrants. Now the big agribusinesses and the sweatshops and the site location consultants go down to Mexico or Guatemala or wherever, and they say, hey, listen, you get this land that they're not living on it, but we're going to lease it at a very low price, and we'll give some of your people work in the fields. We're going to grow flowers and broccoli to send back to the United States. And we'll pay your people, but we won't pay them very much, but it's better than having them make nothing at all. And the manufacturers go down and say, we're going to open sweatshops in Central America. They've done this because now you've got cheap labor, people that are suffering. They used to make a pretty good living as a subsistence farmer. They didn't necessarily make much money, but they could live off their land and make some money from selling corn. And now they can't do that anymore.
Well, what's amazing.
So the site location consultants go in, and all over the world, these countries are now competing, whether it's Vietnam or Mexico or whatever, that these big corporations go in, and the countries' economies are devastated, and the big corporations go in and they say, hey, just don't tax us, and we'll keep your labor rates low, and we'll employ people. And so now the governments can go in and say, hey, our employment statistics are getting better, even though the people are making terribly low wages.
They're essentially slaves.
They're slaves, and if they get sick, they get laid off, they get fired.
Oh, jeez.
But this is, so when you say, shouldn't the countries be doing something? The countries can't. They're so devastated in so many ways, and they're devastated by laws like NAFTA, CAFTA, and TTIP, and TPP, these trade agreements that are now up for vote or being promoted deeply, they'll do this even worse.
What's crazy is that it's conscious, right? These people are brilliant and they're consciously doing it.
Absolutely. That's the modern economic hitman. They've gotten so much more sophisticated than I ever was in my day.
But now, back in your day, NSA recruited you and you were actually educated by some of those secret agencies. Now, but today they aren't. Do you think some of them still are, or do you think they still are?
Yeah. The whole system I described in my book is still very, very much in effect. In addition, however, today, so different from in my day, every major corporation also has its equivalent of economic hitmen. All the big global corporations have agents who are out there promoting just that corporation. So
we've just culturally changed where we're all doing that based on the new economic model.
And not only are we doing it in what we used to call the third world of the economically developing countries, but we're doing it throughout Europe and the United States. And here in the United States, we're doing it to our college students by putting them deep into debt. We're doing it with credit card debt. We're doing it with a terrible health system that we have where people, if they get sick, they go into deep debt. And so this whole debt process thing, we're doing it through the banks that encourage people to take out larger mortgages on houses that they can really afford and then get them stuck and will foreclose and repackage. I mean, all of that's in the book. We've seen so much of it in the past few years during the recession that supposedly ended in 2009. This is just, it's gotten so much deeper.
Well, how about like with people that have new innovations and they're suppressed, they're just not allowed to develop their new products?
Well, yeah, that's another whole category. And if they do develop them, then, they get bought out and their lives get threatened, or something gets threatened, that something's going to be exposed about them that'll ruin their marriage, their family, whatever. And so the innovator who's created an amazing new kind of battery or whatever, it gets bought out by a company that doesn't want to see that battery go on the market, or that whatever that item is, buy them out, threaten them, and also offer them some money, usually, sometimes a fairly substantial amount, and then the product it just disappears.
Well, you've had extensive experience around the world with different cultures. What does the rest of the world think of us?
Well, it depends on where you are. There's no general answer to that. And it's interesting that people as individuals generally like Americans as individuals. We're usually considered to be kind of fun and kind of silly and enjoyable to have in your country as a guest, as a tourist. Most every place deeply fears our armies, our system. There's a tremendous fear. There's an understanding around the world in general. And again, I'm really generalizing here.
Sure. And it depends on the countries and the areas of the world. Yeah,
but there's a what I'm surprised by is I can talk to peasants in La Paz, Bolivia, who have a greater knowledge of the nefarious role that the U.S. and its corporations have played around the world than some people with PhDs in this country have. We just don't understand so much of this, and that a lot of the world understands a lot better than we do. At the same time, it must be said that people from around the world have this idea of the American dream, that they think they want to live here. And so often once they get here, they find that the dream is totally a fantasy. They find that, like most countries in Europe and in Latin America and many other places if you work for an organization there, you get 13 months of pay, you get a lot more leave of absence, you get vacations, and you get health care, and so on. They come here and they find that they may make a much greater salary, but they have to spend an awful lot more of it on some of their basic needs. And, our politicians will say, well, yeah, look at Italy. Yeah, they've got free health care or almost free and so on, but you got to pay 50-60% of your income goes to paying taxes to cover that. The fact of the matter is, in the United States, it's not a direct tax, but when we get sick or when something happens, we end up paying a lot more, and it really is a form of taxation that these services that we don't get, our education, our health care, and public transportation, and on and on.
Oh, we might pay more in taxes than they do if you think about it that way.
Yeah. Well, yes,
if you think of it as that's a form of taxation because we have to pay it ourselves, and then if you figure out what they pay versus what we pay, that's interesting. And I didn't think about it that way.
Well, not only that we do pay more. You can look at the statistics and see that the average American does pay a lot more for those things ultimately, but also there's a tremendous amount of stress. Because when you've got to pay these things, when you do get sick, when something does come up, when you've got to pay that student loan off, the huge stress. Whereas if it's included in your tax base, and you know that when you go to school, it's basically going to be free. If you get sick, you're going to be taken care of. When you get old, you're going to have a retirement. Somebody's going to take care of you. If you know all of that, even though you're paying 50% of your income in taxes, you're likely to have a much more relaxed state of mind than if you're constantly fretting and worrying that something might happen to you, or what am I going to do when I retire? I've got to keep working until I'm 80 because I can't afford not to. And so I can't go to school. I can't pay. And once I get out of school, I can't do what I want to do because I got to go to work for big corporations so I can pay off my student loan.
Well, but I think people are afraid of the government doing everything because they're notoriously bad at it, and because the government has taken advantage of us. We just don't want them doing everything. We want them out of our lives. A lot of people do.
But that's a misconception that we believe that. We say we want small government, and yet something between 50 and 60 cents on every dollar of taxes that we do pay goes to the military.
Yeah,
which is huge.
That's crazy.
So we support we support a huge government. We've got the biggest government in the world, if you include the military. What we don't have is a government that takes care of the basic needs of its people. We're not paying for that, and we're being told by a lot of our elected officials, and especially the Republicans, but from all walks of life, that we want small government. The government's way too big. At the same time, these same people are saying, but let's put more money into the military. Well, the military is government. That's the main expense that we have in government. It goes to the military.
Is it hard for you to see, because we take all of our resources and we have a ton of money, and you're seeing it filtering into the military and abuses all over the world. And if we could take these same resources and help our people, we would just be in such better shape.
Imagine. Yes, absolutely.
Is that what bothers you so much, is because?
That's one of the things. Imagine, just imagine that if we put our tax dollars to, instead of paying corporations to make missiles and armored plating and so on and so forth to fight wars, if instead we get these same corporations to come up with techniques and systems for mining all the plastic that's floating around in the oceans, and for mining and reusing all the oil that's been spilled in the Amazon and the deserts of the Middle East and around every every gas station in the United States and the rest of the world. And imagine if we got companies that are currently making seeds and agricultural products and using huge agribusiness that pollutes the earth, if instead we got them to come up with techniques that allowed hungry people to grow food more efficiently and organically and distribute it, store it and distribute it. And imagine if we paid companies to really come up with new technologies for energy. We've seen a huge takeoff in the last 10 years of solar and wind. That's wonderful. But these methods for creating energy with solar and wind, at someday we'll look at them as extremely archaic. There's a whole new. Well,
I did a show on tapping the zero-point energy field. You got to listen to that one. That one's incredible.
Yeah.
Came out of the University of Colorado. They have a great physics department.
Sarah, there's so much that we could do to be better.
Okay, but I got to ask you.
Transportation, but we're putting the money into weapons instead to kill people. And when we kill people, when we use drones, we create more problems than we solve. And
I just think that's so much.
Obvious can it be to people that all the militarization we've done since 9/11 has done nothing to make the world safer. The world's more dangerous now than it was in 9/11.
But I think with the military, that can, with the automation and drones and automating, satellites and stuff, a lot of that should be a lot less expensive. So I get confused as to where all that money's going. But I got to ask you, it's airing right now. This where I always record my shows ahead of time, but the show that is airing this week is on terrorism. And one of the things that we talked about is modern warfare is really terrorism, because people are afraid of the West. We have so much power that terrorism is a way, states can't come up forward and say we are going to declare war against the U.S. And so wealthy individuals and, unsanctioned state activities and, black money goes into terrorist activities. And with a lot of the world not liking the United States because of all of our tactics, and for whatever reason, it's not Bush saying they hate our freedoms. It's they just don't like how we operate. And, face it, there's always going to be clashes of culture. How do we protect ourselves in this new world of where we really find ourselves in? No, China could easily come up and become us.
So I think we have, first of all.
Do you know what I mean? What do we do? And if we have to have what level of military should we have?
I would say very, very, a lot less than what we have today, a lot less. Let's put the money into doing away with the causes of desperation. Let's put some of the money into doing away with the causes of desperation in our own country.
Then we'd be a lot safer.
But also, do away with these trade agreements and things that cause desperation. There's no such thing as global terrorism. There are global acts of terror. But an ism is a group of people that share principles. FARC in Colombia doesn't have anything in common with Al-Qaeda or the Somali.
No, it's individual. They're individual terrorist cells that are not connected.
The one thing they have in common is desperate people. And so you get a fanatic that comes along who may be very wealthy, like Osama bin Laden. It's a fanatic, and he gets a huge following. Why? Because there's desperate people. You don't blow yourself up unless you're desperate.
So you get rid of the reason for them to be desperate, and then their armies go away.
Exactly.
I mean, there just isn't a huge percentage of nut jobs out there, but there are a huge percentage of desperate people. So we eliminate the desperate people, and they don't have an army because there just isn't enough nut jobs to form an army.
Yeah. I mean, and ISIS is a great example of how that organization's grown up because of the violence, because of the desperation, because a lot of people have suffered as a result of the war in the Middle East. And, I think another question that we ought to be asking ourselves, and if you're doing a show on terrorism, one of the questions is, how does ISIS manage itself? I know a lot of people in the Middle East I've talked to about this who say, we don't have very good management systems in a lot of our countries and so forth. ISIS is managing itself like a big corporation. Where did they get the managers? Who trained them? Who's behind that? Where did these people come from? The United States just recently bragged that we've taken out the finance minister of ISIS and a couple of their other high-level people. But where did these people come from? Who trained them? How did this organization suddenly, unlike Al-Qaeda, which had one guy at the top and a lot of charisma and was very disorganized, how did suddenly an organization arise in the Middle East, a terrorist organization that's so well funded?
Yeah, but see, that's what I did ask him those questions. Because there's a lot of evidence to show that the United States actually funded ISIS. Why would we do that?
It's a good question, isn't it?
That's the why is what I'm trying to figure out.
And I don't know that the United States did. And a lot of Middle Easterners say, well, maybe it was Britain, because Britain feels left out because the United States has suddenly pretty much taken over the influence in the Middle East that Britain and France and other European countries used to have. I don't know. I'm not at all suggesting that.
But you know what I mean? There has to be a motive, and I can't figure that out. Although there is a lot of evidence to show that we did do that, and Obama's his way he went after ISIS was a joke and laughable. I mean, Russia came in there and took them out overnight, essentially, really set them back. So we weren't even serious about going after them. So that makes you wonder. But what the heck is our motive to support ISIS? I mean, that's crazy.
Well, what we do know is that it's making a lot of money.
Well, I know, and that's so hard. It's hard for people to mentally go there and say it's kind of like the Plato's allegory where, you look at the shadows on the wall and you don't want to look at the light, because I just don't want to think, you don't want to believe that we'd go that low to make money. It's just, you know what I mean?
Well, sure.
I don't want to be in a country that can go that low. And so it's really hard to embrace that.
We have to change
it. And if people are doing that, they don't belong here, because that's not what our people are about.
And that all has mushroomed since 1976, when the mandate was given to corporations to maximize profits. Before that, during part of the 70s, you had a growing trend. Vietnam, corporations saw that they could become extremely wealthy on a war that we lost. We haven't won a war since, basically since World War II, but corporations have made a lot of money. And then after Vietnam, there was such a strong reaction because of the draft and so forth to war that the Economic Hitman system was used to spread capitalism around the world.
It's way more effective.
It was successful, but there was a whole segment of corporate America, global corporations that were losing out on that, the military sector. And they began to make waves at the late 90s. Geez,
that makes sense.
And then 9/11 happened, and that gave the perfect excuse to remilitarize.
Yeah, but a lot of the money goes into the military now for space activities. I mean, I think they could be redirected in transparent space activities.
Well, we're not just talking about the military. We're talking about all the peripheral activity.
Yeah, I know.
The construction companies. So you wipe out.
Construction is big.
You wipe out Iraq, and you send corporations in to rebuild it to make a lot of money.
How can people see more of your work?
Go to my website, johnperkins.org. Sign up for my newsletter. You got to actually put your email address in a little box there. Buy the book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Come hear me speak. It's all on my website. Come on trips that I take people on to learn from indigenous people in Colombia and Guatemala and other places who have so much to teach us. There's so much they can do. But the main thing, go to johnperkins.org.
Okay, well, great. I'll have that up on my website. I appreciate you spending time with us today.
Thanks, Sarah. Keep up your good work. And also on Facebook and Twitter, so don't leave that out. But yeah, thank you. Keep up your great work. Keep exposing the truth.